It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker for the talk, Mengdi Wang. She is an associate professor at Princeton University. Her research interests lie in machine learning theory and developing generative AI algorithms. And in this talk, she will be speaking about guiding diffusion models towards generative optimization. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Mengdi, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation. So you can hear me, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the theory of diffusion models, especially how to think about diffusion models as a general optimizer. Okay, and also like this is a series of works in collaboration with like postdoc fellows and PhD students in my lab. Okay, anyway, so when we think about generative AI, usually there are two classes of models. One is just like discrete autoregressive models, which is how we generate languages. The other class, which is considered mostly for continuous, but now we're also extending it to discrete generation, is diffusion models. So when we think about diffusion models, we think about basically some way to transform a distribution of noise into a distribution over real data. Okay. So I think since this is the workshop about diffusion models, so I'm going to just go very quickly in my like introduction slides. So if we think about this like generation, so I think this concept dated back to like I think 11 years ago, like when people try to compress high dimensional data into lower dimensional embeddings using autoencoders. So at that time, the autoencoder consists of an encoder and a decoder, and the middle layer is the low dimensional representation. So, but as a byproduct, people realize that, hey, I can actually play around with the decoder, right? So if I can just get rid of the encoder and only try to work with the decoder. So if we input some Gaussian noise to the decoder, it actually is going to generate something meaningful and interesting. So that is the first time people realize that, hey, we can not only compress, we can also generate. Okay. So very like soonish, there was another pretty famous model at that time, which is the generative adversarial networks. So GANs were developed as a model for discrimination task for like classification, for example. But in order to improve discrimination, so people couple the discriminator with a generator so they can like, I would say like counter attack each other and figure out some min-max solution. So again, the generator was a byproduct, but this particular byproduct was very interesting. It was able to generate images which are more, I would say, real life alike. Okay, so basically a generative AI, I think like the root partially come from VAE and GANs, and generation used to be a byproduct of other machine learning tasks. Okay, so now we think about generation, we think about just a class of methods that are able to map noise into data, and by data we mean like image, text, audio, video, or protein structures, or even more complicated industrial designs. Okay, but now if we think about this very early models for generation, right? Like the decoder in VAE or the generator in GANs. So they were pretty simple generators, okay? So in both cases, they were a single neural network, which is supposed to be trained to directly map noise into a structured data point. So basically we're asking this single neural network to do a lot of work, okay? And now when we think about diffusion models, they are really like, so this is really a revolution because it is changing the way we think about generation. We're not trying to rely on a single neural network to map noise into data, okay? So instead, we think about, we're actually trying to find a controlled dynamics that is going to map an initial noise distribution through a sequence of transformations into a distribution of data points. So in some way, we can think about this as a stochastic control problem. Okay. Wait. Okay. And now when we think about diffusion models, it can generate videos, it can generate proteins, and many others. Okay. So basically, diffusion models is about learning to control a dynamical process, a stochastic dynamical process. Okay, mapping the noise initial distribution to some nice distribution over structured data. Okay. And then what we are learning, so the neural network, we are learning the score function. What is it? We're really trying to learn a controller. So this particular neural network, either a UNet or a transformer or whatever like architecture we like to work with, we're trying to not approximate this entire transformation from noise to data. Okay. Instead, we're trying to break it down into a controlled generation process, and we're trying to use a neural network to approximate the controller. So this makes the whole process much easier to learn because we can think about this. If we think about the whole process as one-step transformation, it's going to be pretty spiky. If we think about the optimization landscape, it's going to be there are going to be like a lot of like local minimums, and it's very hard to navigate. But if we try to break down the overall process into a controlled sequence of state transitions, now every single transformation can be smooth and easier to approximate and easier to estimate. Okay, so this is the big underlying idea. Okay, so I assume everyone has already taken tutorials on diffusion models, so I'm going to just go over this very quickly. So again, the very one of the very first idea is that, okay, so if we want to transform noise to data, this is non-trivial, right? But if we think about the reverse of the process, what if we simply want to transform the data distribution into a distribution of white noise? And this is very easy, right? We can design the different SDEs to do this, right? Okay, and we designed the forward process to be an OU process, so the limiting distribution is well defined. Okay, and the mathematics of diffusion models were done a long time ago in 1980s, right? So you can give me any forward OU process, okay, and one can derive the analytical form of the time reversal of the forward process. So we call this time reversal the backward process, okay, and the drift term in the backward process is what we call the score function. We can also think about it as like this controller that will make sure that the backward process will reverse the forward process. Another way to think about the score function is that it is really, we're trying to really steer the backward generation process along the gradient of the log likelihood of the marginal distribution in the forward process. Okay, so once we can lay out the mathematics, the problem reduces to how to estimate the score function. And wait, okay, I'm going to simplify all the mathematics. So basically, one can simulate the forward process very easily by first sampling from the data distribution and adding Gaussian noise to simulate the forward OU process, right? And then by drawing samples from the simulated forward process, one can try to estimate the score function in the backward process by doing supervised learning, okay? And let's skip all the mathematics. Okay, so let's now ask questions about the process. So we really want to know if we are able to trust diffusion models. So we're going to use diffusion models not only to generate artwork and movies. We also want to use diffusion models to generate, for example, protein structures, to generate drug designs, or even use them to generate, I would say, like architectural plans. So we really want to know if the model can be trusted, and what we want to know what can be learned and how efficient it can learn the underlying data distribution. Okay. Okay, so we're going to ask two questions here. The first question is we're going to ask if diffusion models can actually learn the underlying data distribution. Okay. And the second question is, okay, now if I want to control the diffusion model to generate an optimal design for some external task, then how do we do that? How can we control the generation process efficiently? And can we understand this in the theoretical framework of optimization? Okay, so let's look at the first question. So let's try to understand if diffusion models can learn the underlying data distribution. Okay, so the first thing I want to mention is that practical data are always structured and low-dimensional in nature. Okay, so for example, if we think about the data set of teapots, pictures of teapots taken from different angles, okay, so the intrinsic dimension of the teapot data set is actually only one, because there's only one degree of freedom. Okay, in other words, we can embed all the pictures of teapots into a ring. Okay, and the ring has intrinsic dimension 1. Okay, and so computer scientists try to estimate the intrinsic dimension of the image manifold from popular data sets. The way to do that is we can imagine some sort of like nearest neighbor approximation together with manifold learning. Okay, so it turns out that even for the biggest data set, ImageNet, the intrinsic dimension, the best intrinsic dimension people can get is 43, which means that the entire ImageNet can be embedded into a manifold of intrinsic dimension 43. So data are actually not as high dimensional as we think. Okay. So now the question is, we want to know if diffusion models can learn the intrinsic low-dimensional manifold structure of the dataset. Okay, so recall that we are trying to understand the dynamics and the limiting distribution of the backward generation process. Okay, so I'm writing down its SDE here. Okay, so now let's imagine that. So basically, when we think about the backward process, okay, we're going to start with a random Gaussian initial point, which is a random data point, which is a random point in the high dimensional space. So we're going to use capital D to denote the ambient dimension, the high dimension. Okay, but we want to understand how can the generation process eventually converge to a distribution over a degenerate lower dimensional manifold. Okay, so if diffusion models can truly learn structured data's intrinsic structure, okay, then it should be able to start with this high dimensional Gaussian distribution and eventually converge to a distribution over a low dimensional manifold. And this is the mathematics we want to understand. Okay, and to do this, let's make some assumption. I'm going to assume that my raw data, denoted by X, admitted some low-dimensional structure. Okay, so each X corresponds to some latent variable of a smaller dimension, little d, but X has a higher ambient dimension, this capital D. Okay, and we're not going to make any assumption on the distribution of my data X. I'm only assuming that it corresponds to a low-dimensional latent variable. Okay, so there is some low-dimensional manifold structure, which we want to figure out if the diffusion model can learn. Okay, so to analyze this, let's also simplify the score network. So let's try to simplify a UNet. So we do know that the UNet is like a multi-resolution architecture with skip connection at each level. Okay, so we're going to simplify the UNet into one single level, and we're going to preserve its nonlinearity. Okay, so the diagram on the right hand side is the simplification. Okay, so we preserve one single residual link, the shortcut. Okay, and to represent the nonlinear mappings in the conv layers, I'm going to simplify them to an encoder, a linear encoder, a nonlinear ReLU network F theta in the middle, and another linear decoder. Okay, so here, okay, so this is a simplification of the UNet architecture where we're simplify the convolutional layers into linear encoder and simply ReLU fully connected layers to express nonlinearity. Okay, and we're going to assume that my score function is going to be approximated from this simplified class of networks. Okay. Okay. So to really understand score function, so now we have two assumptions. One is that data admits some low-dimensional latent structure. Second assumption is that we have this simplified UNet score function class. Under these two assumptions, one can work out the mathematics of the ground truth score function. So it turns out that if my data admits a low-dimensional structure, my score function naturally decomposes into two parts, and this decomposition doesn't require any additional distributional assumption. Okay, so basically the score function naturally decomposes to as a component that is parallel to the latent subspace or the latent manifold. And there's another component of the score function, which is orthogonal to the latent manifold or latent subspace. Okay. So now if we think about the backward generation process, assuming that we're using the true score, which admits this decomposition. And now what happens is that the backward process actually also decomposes to two parts. Okay, let's assume that the latent space is linear. In this case, we can decompose the backward process into the projection onto the linear subspace and the remaining orthogonal components. And the two processes, they are still coupled together, but they actually have very different dynamics. The orthogonal part of the backward SDE actually contracts to 0 at a geometric rate, which explains why diffusion models can actually learn and converge to latent data distribution on a low-dimensional manifold. Okay. Okay, so one can generalize this analysis from linear subspace to general smooth manifold. Again, the idea is to think about the decomposition, which decomposes the full dimensional SDE into two parts: the unsubspace or unmanifold low dimensional SDE and the orthogonal parts. Okay, and if the assumption is that my data belongs to a smooth manifold, then we have to deal with additional hassles like the crossover terms, which actually do not change the mean conclusions. Okay, so in a paper we wrote last year, so we established I think one of the first statistical rates for diffusion models as a density estimator. And also we show that why the diffusion model can converge to the true data distribution. And the rate of convergence is determined by little d, which is the intrinsic dimension of the data manifold. Okay, so it's not the capital D. So this explains, in some ways, it explains why diffusion models naturally adapt to low-dimensional structured data distribution. Okay, so Okay, so essentially we have like on a very coarse, we have like provided a very coarse-grained answer to the first research question. Remember, the first research question is we want to ask whether or how can diffusion models learn underlying data distribution. So our statistical rates show that the sample efficiency of training a diffusion model to learn a data distribution depends on the latent little d. Okay, so diffusion models are provably efficient estimator of data distributions supported on low-dimensional manifolds. Okay, so this also explains why diffusion models can generalize well and generate new designs. Okay, secondly, we want to talk about optimization. We want to think about, hey, if I want to generate a new protein that would bind to a specific target, how can we guarantee that we're finding an optimal solution? How can we control the generation towards specific objectives? And we want to know how efficient can we do that? Okay. So if we want to tweak the limiting distribution of the backward SDE, okay, one way to think about is we can do conditioned generation. So for example, when we try to generate an image, or if I want to generate an image of a dog, then I'm going to provide an input, which is labeled Y. I'm going to set Y to be equal to a dog. And this is going to be a prompt or an input to my diffusion model. Okay. And if the diffusion models has learned the conditional distribution of images conditioned on that Y equals a dog, okay, then the diffusion model can generate a dog as we wished. So here the key idea is that we're going to replace the score function with a conditional score function. So here in this conditional score function, we are conditioning on Y, which is the input prompt. Okay, so suppose that we have a neural network that has estimated this entire conditional score for all possible values of Y. Okay, then we should be able to generate images conditioned on any value of Y. Okay, and another way to think about this condition Y equals a dog is to think about as a guidance. Okay, there are different heuristic approaches to try to approximately realize the conditioned generation process. And for example, people have come up with classifier-free guidance, classifier guidance, and there are many other different heuristic or different approximations to do conditioned generation. Okay. So very similarly, so diffusion models or conditional diffusion models also applies to reinforcement learning and control. Okay, so when we think about reinforcement learning, usually we have an agent, we have an environment, then we have to learn a queue function, a policy network, and they have to be updated together in some way, and then we have to tune a bunch of parameters. Okay, but however, like researchers actually came up with ways to use diffusion model to replace all the reinforcement learning algorithms. So the idea is to try to collect labeled state transition trajectories for the control task, and then ask a diffusion model to train a score function to learn about all the joint distribution between state, trajectories, constraints, and rewards. And then the diffusion model is going to generate new state trajectories. Okay. So we apply this approach to a very simple control problem. Okay, so the goal in this control problem is to keep the single lab, the hopper, hopping. Okay, so it works by, we start with an offline data set. And in the offline data sets, the hopper doesn't do too well yet, but we're going to feed the offline data set to a diffusion model to learn about the joint distribution between rewards and the state trajectory. And once we can do that, we can say that, hey, let's condition on having a higher reward value. Can you generate a new state trajectory? Okay, so we play around with the diffusion model and also benchmark it against other offline reinforcement learning algorithms. So what's surprising is that actually by using only diffusion model, we're actually going to get comparable or even better performance than the best off-policy RL algorithm. So this means that actually it is sufficient to use conditional sampling or to use distribution, to use density approximation and distribution sampling to learn about new control policies in this particular task. And this kind of diffusion models they are actually now widely used in robotics and robot learning as the architecture for learning from off-policy data. Okay, so we want to understand why. Why can diffusion models beat RL algorithms? Okay, so the basic idea which I'm trying to promote is that we can actually use diffusion models, or more generally, we can use generative AI models to solve any optimization problem. Okay, so if we think about traditional or classical optimization, usually we have a decision variable x, we have an objective function f, right? We want to maximize f of x. And usually we think about we have a very complicated landscape and we have to come up with some optimization solver, maybe stochastic gradient descent or simulated annealing or tree search or just something. We have to come up with something, or training a neural network. Okay, we have to come up with something to navigate the landscape of the function f. Okay, so classical optimization solvers, they are actually already pretty good. However, optimization solvers, they are very poor in terms of making use of data, especially unlabeled data. Okay, so what if we convert every single optimization problem into a generation problem or into a conditional sampling problem? Okay, let's imagine that we have this underlying joint distribution between x, the decision variable, and y equals f of x, which is the objective function. Okay, what if we can train a generative AI model to learn about this joint distribution, and then we can sample x by conditioning on the event that I want my y to have a higher or even to have an optimal value. Okay, so in this way, we can rethink optimization as a generation problem. So the nice thing is that now we can utilize pre-trained data. We can utilize massive amount of unlabeled data for pre-training, and hopefully our AI model can help us, can make it easier for us to navigate over higher dimensional structured state space. Okay, so we try to understand the optimization theory for this. So we initially we started with an offline optimization setting, assuming that we have a big unlabeled data set and a smaller. So in the unlabeled data set, we have a large collection of x, the decision variable. We can imagine it. We have a large collection of like unlabeled, unmeasured natural proteins, for example. Okay, and then we have a smaller data set of labels. So for each label data, we have x and y. For example, we can think about we have a collection of proteins with a particular measured biochemical function. Okay, and now we're going to train a diffusion model to solve an optimization problem. So based on the mixture of unlabeled data and labeled data, we want to know, can we generate or can we find a better design x with a higher objective value f of x? Okay. So in other words, this is really an off-policy bandit problem, but we want to solve this using diffusion models. Okay. So we provided a meta algorithm. Okay, so the meta algorithm is intuitively very simple. So it's like a unified framework. Actually, it contains both classifier guidance and classifier free guidance as special cases. Okay, so the first step is we are going to train a reward model using the label data. So we should be able to predict y, the fitness value for every single x. Okay, and the second step is I'm going to use the reward model to assign pseudo labels. So for every single unlabeled x, meaning that we are going to predict the objective value for every single x in my pre-trained in my pre-training data sets. Okay, so once we do that, we can use the data sets with all the pseudo labels or with all the estimated rewards to train a big conditional diffusion model. And finally, when we use the diffusion model for optimization and generation, we can say that, hey, let's set the reward target to be equal to some value A, and let's generate a solution X. Okay, so this is basically how people are using conditional generation for reward optimization. Okay, so we studied this, we investigated the theoretical properties of this method. So there are a lot of like caveats here, because whenever we're trying to generate something new, we're intentionally introducing distribution shift, right? And also there's distribution shift between reward learning and unsupervised and training of diffusion models. And whenever we want to generate a new sample with higher optimization value, we are taking the limiting distribution, we're taking the target distribution to be further away from the training distribution of the diffusion model. And this is going to be something that we want to analyze theoretically. Okay. So again, so in a paper from our group last year, so we provided the off-policy optimization theory for reward guided conditional diffusion models. So we were able to like pretty like sharply characterize the best optimality gap we can obtain by treating diffusion models as an off-policy optimizer. Okay, so there are a lot of technical details, and the short story is that we can show that the dominating term in the optimality gap matches the minimax off-policy regret in off-policy bandit. And another key observation is that so this optimal regret is the optimal regret in the latent low-dimensional space. Okay, so if we directly apply off-policy bandit to this setting, it wouldn't work because off-policy bandit does not know the latent representation. So this is matching off-policy bandit assuming known latent representations. Okay, in other words, it is theoretically efficient to use diffusion models and reward condition diffusion models for off-policy optimization together with latent representation learning. Okay, so we had non-parametric versions of the result, which I'm going to skip. Okay, again, so this is another numerical experiment we generated. So when we do condition generation, we can actually set any target reward value, right? But as I explained, if we enlarge the target reward value, okay, so the quality of generation is going to improve at first because we are extrapolating and improving the rewards, right? But as we extrapolate too much, the distribution shift is going to be too large, and the quality of the images will actually degrade because we are just shifting away from the training distribution, and everything we have learned starts to collapse. Okay, and this is also theoretically validated in our bounds. Okay, so how much time do I have? Okay, So like I'll be done in like 5 more minutes. So the last topic is that if we try to train a conditional diffusion model to solve a reward optimization problem, okay? So this is theoretically doable, as I explained, and in theory, we show that this is working, okay? However, this is not practical at all, okay? So essentially, whenever we wanna generate using a new reward function, in some way, we have to approximate the overall joint distribution between decision variable and the reward, right? Which means that we have to retrain a diffusion model for every single new optimization target. And this is definitely not something we want to do. So what we want to do is that we want to make this method much more adaptive and lightweighted. And we want to have optimization theoretical guarantees, okay? So let's try to solve the same optimization problem, okay, but using a different approach. So in unconditional generation, we have a score function, okay? In condition generation, we have a condition score function. So S is the score function with Y being part of the input. So we cannot do conditional generation because conditional scores are hard to learn. Instead, we want to add a simple guidance to the generation process in a way very similar to classifier guidance, right? So in classifier guidance, the conditional score actually decomposes into the unconditional score plus another term, which is the gradient of the log classifier logit. We want to extend this idea to general optimization. Okay, so the nice thing here is that we want to retain the unconditional score function we have learned from pre-training, and we want to be able to add a simple guidance, this simple additional control term to steer the distribution of the generating process to something we want. Okay, so now my question is as follows. Okay, so again, we have an optimization problem. We want to maximize f of x, and the data, the x, supposedly is going to belong to some latent manifold or latent subspace. Okay, we want to figure out a way to add guidance G to a pre-trained diffusion model. So we're going to suppose that we already have a pre-trained score function as theta, which is pretty good. Okay, and we want to add an additional guidance to change the dynamics. So a very simple idea is, hey, we want to do optimization, right? So what if we just do gradient optimization? What if we set the gradients, the guidance term, to be proportional to the gradient of f at x? What can we just do that? Okay, so if we can simply add an additional gradient term, then it's very easy to see that we are following a particular dynamics, but we're also steering it towards function improvement directions, right? So we can look at a toy model. So for example, if both my x and y are Gaussian, okay, then one can actually look at the conditional score function of x given y, which decomposes to the pre-trained score function of x and additional term. So this additional term is actually proportional to little g, which is the gradient direction of this linear function. And there are additional I would say additional terms in the guidance which relates to the gap between the expected target reward and the current expectation of reward at xt. Okay, so there are a bunch of mathematical details which I'm going to skip actually. Okay. So one can try to utilize this linear Gaussian special case to design a general gradient guidance for any objective function. So we try to do that, okay? But it turns out that this doesn't work. So what happens is that the reason is very simple to understand. So as I explained, so when the true data distribution belongs to a linear latent subspace or a latent manifold, then the score function is directing the generation process to start from high dimensional Gaussian noise, and it's going to converge to the low dimensional latent subspace. Okay, but however, if we just add a gradient vector, we can scale it, we can engineer it, but if we simply tweak the dynamics towards an arbitrary gradient direction, so this additional gradient is going to jeopardize the low dimensional structure that was learned from pre-training. So this does not work. Okay, so we have to figure out ways to fix this. Okay, so it turns out that we choose to now to use gradient. Instead, we follow the idea of first order proximal optimization. We added the gradient term of a quadratic regularization. Okay. Okay, so I'll omit the details here. Okay, so basically the idea is that we're going to measure the look ahead gap between our target reward value y and the expectation of reward at the current xt using a linearization. Okay, and turns out that this square loss can be estimated using a function of the score network, and by taking autograd of this particular loss function, the latent structure that has learned from pre-training is preserved because we're doing the computation utilizing the pre-trained score function. Okay, so we can solve the problem that naive gradient will jeopardize the latent structure. Okay, by using the quadratic loss, the proximal term with gradient, we can solve the problem. Okay, so so we were able to propose a pretty general framework for using diffusion model, for adapting diffusion models for generative optimization. So here you can give me any pre-trained diffusion, any pre-trained score function, and you can give me any optimization function. And I need to have a gradient oracle. By using the gradient oracle, we're able to compute this additional guidance term that will both improve the objective value and preserve the latent manifold structure learned from pre-training. Okay, and we can use this very simple gradient guidance method to adapt any pre-trained diffusion network. So we only tweak the backward generation process, and we can use this to optimize any new objective function. Okay, I'll skip the pseudocode. Okay, so for theorem for the optimization theory. Okay, so I think a very interesting theoretical insight is that whenever we're adding additional guidance to tweak the generation process of diffusion model, okay, so by doing so, we are able to solve a regularized optimization problem. So here we were able to show provable convergence, actually exponential convergence to the maximizer x star lambda, which is a regularized solution to my objective function f of x. So here the regularization in this is the special case when pre-training data is Gaussian. Okay, the regularization actually is saying that because we're using a pre-trained score function, the pre-trained score function will always try to keep the generating solutions to be proximal to the pre-trained distribution. And this regularization term is basically a reflection of the use of a pre-trained score as a prior. And actually, we cannot make this regularization term to go to 0, because if we take it too far, we have distribution shift. So we can characterize the best optimization solution one can achieve by adding guidance to a diffusion model for solving a new optimization problem. Okay, so basically pre-trained score is a prior And in the language of optimization, it's a regularization term. Okay, so if we want to find a global optimal solution, okay, then we have to do not only gradient guidance, we have to do adaptive fine-tuning. Okay, so if in our iterative optimization process, we are able to add newly generated samples back to fine-tune the pre-trained score function. In this way, we are going to be able to update the score function, which means that we are going to update the regularization term in the optimization problem, right? So if you are familiar with like proximal optimization, it means that if we iteratively update the proximal term of an regularized problem, we are going to eventually solve the global optimal problem. Okay, so similar here. I'm going to skip. So the short answer is that if we are able to add additional gradient guidance in the decoding process, and if we can further use the newly generated samples to fine-tune the score function, then we can use this iterative process to generate solutions that are in expectation to be globally optimal for any optimization objective. And if my data belong to some low-dimensional subspace, even the rate of optimization convergence would be better, because when we do generation, we are essentially only navigating over the lower dimensional space. This means that the optimization process is actually faster. Okay. And again, this is under the assumption that my objective, my reward function is concave, and we're assuming this particular encode decoder function class for my score function, for my score network. Okay, so finally, I think diffusion models or generative AI models actually are taking us to a new modality for optimization. Instead of solving for a solution in a bounded set, we are able to generate solutions to optimization problems. And we can think about pre-training as a form of regularization as a prior, but one can also think about online optimization as a in the form of like iterative fine-tuning and self-play. And diffusion models really give us a way to provably utilize latent data with latent structures, which also means that if we rely on diffusion models for generative optimization, we can even solve optimization faster, and we can optimize over objects that were not optimizable before using traditional methods. Anyway, so that's my last slide. Thank you very much.
Do we have any questions?
Hello, thank you for the
Hello.
very nice. So I would just like to ask about the gradient guidance. You said that wouldn't, so just adding the gradients doesn't work.
Right.
Wouldn't it be, so I mean, obviously it's not the same thing, but intuitively, I think it is like, if you add just the gradient guidance, is it not tilting the distribution at time zero with exponential minus g? Sorry, exponential minus f? And if you add the temperature, inverse temperature term in front, can you not just always guarantee that as you increase that inverse temperature, you're gonna, your data distribution at time zero will concentrate on the minimizers of f within the support of the diffusion model, well, the data distribution. So I don't
I'm
know.
not sure if I fully get your idea. So I'm trying to say that, so without adding gradient guidance, right, the process is supposed to be contracting towards the subspace. But if we add the gradient guidance, then this contraction is no longer there. So that's what I'm saying. So it's not related to the temperature. It's really about, are we like tweaking the direction towards something we don't want? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess I'm thinking more about the Langevin diffusion, but okay, the second question then.
Actually, so in our paper, we actually have numerical results trying the naive gradients, and we can show that it's going to I mean, eventually generate a much bigger gap compared to this other versions of gradient guidance that we came up with. Yeah.
Okay, I see. Just one small question. What is the relationship with this and the proximal, as you said, proximal methods?
Oh yeah, I think like in the mathematical proof, right? So basically, I think what's really interesting is that, okay, so we were able to show that, as long as we're using the pre-trained score, so essentially the samples in the expectation is the maximizer of a regularized optimization problem. Does this make sense? And
Yeah.
here, this x0 bar, this is in the Gaussian case, this is simply the mean of the pre-training distribution. Okay, so I'm saying that, so if we maintain the pre-trained score and only add guidance, this is the best we can do. But if we're allowed to update the pre-trained score, in other words, we're able to update this pre-training distribution, this x0 bar, right? We can update it to the current xt. I mean, not t in decoding process, t in the optimization iterations. Okay, then in this way, we are going to be solving a new regularized optimization problem at every single iteration, right? And in this way, this overall iteration really resembles a proximal optimization iteration. So one can use self-play and fine-tuning to achieve, I would say, a higher level proximal first order iteration. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good question.
Other questions? So probably I have a question. So when you show the next result, I don't see there's dependence on the step size of the backward scheme.
Oh, very good. Yeah, I omitted all the details. Yeah. Yeah, there. I mean, where are the theorems? Yeah, so we actually have a bunch of parameters, and for the theoretical proof, for the full version of the theorem, we specified everything. Yeah.
Right.
Have to be chosen carefully for theoretical purpose.
Okay, right. Any last questions? No? If no, then let us thank Mengdi again for the great talk.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.